Hello everybody and welcome to another video. In this video, I basically want to introduce for loops. And I have to say this is the part of the class where we lose a lot of people mainly because they don't really understand what for loops are or they don't really know how to actually trace through the for loop. So I will try my best to explain for loops as best as the way I understood it, and hopefully you guys are able to understand it the same way I understood it. Let me just give you guys a brief detail of what for loops are. I feel like that's really important because I feel like the majority of the reason why people don't understand for loops is they don't actually understand what it's actually used for. So to give you a brief idea of what for loops is basically the idea of doing a task multiple times for a specific number of times. There are different types of loops. We'll talk about all of them. In this video, specifically want to talk about the for loop. The for loop is basically the idea where we are able to not only do a specific task a certain number of times, but we are able to do it as many times as we want. For example, let's say I want to print out the numbers from 1 to 1000. We talked about, at least in this class, you know how to do that explicitly, meaning you can just do system.out.println 1, system.out.println 2, system.out.println 3. You could do that. That's one way, and it will definitely give you the right answer at the expense of your mental health as well as your time, and probably you'll be there for eternity depending on, for example, if I tell you to print out the numbers from 1 to 5000, as well I could say print out 1 to 1 million. You'll be system.out.println 1 to 1 2 3 4 5 etc. But more specifically, you will probably lose your finger, and more specifically, who has that kind of time? So that's where the idea of for loops comes. For loops basically allows you to simplify that task of not having to type that many lines of code for that number of times. So that's just the idea of for loop. Let me go ahead and show you what I mean. Let's say I want to print out I love me, and I want to print that out, let's say 30 times. Let me just make it not 30 times. I feel like 30 times is a little too much. Let me just print it out 6 times. I mean, I could do system dot dot println I love me, another println. I could do that. Let me go ahead and just show you what I mean. I'll just make a method public static void. I'll call it loops because that's the whole underlying idea for our next couple of videos. System dot out dot println. System.out.println, blah, 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 blah. And I could copy and paste like 500 times if I want to. But more specifically, that's not a good use of my time. So this is where the idea of a for loop comes into play. So let me go ahead and delete it. Let's say uh, I want to print this out 10 times. So this is what the idea of where for loop comes to play. For loop has the idea where we have initialization, a test, and an update. Again, this all happens inside the loop. So an initialization is the idea where you initialize a variable, and the reason why you need to initialize a variable is so that the loop can keep track of that variable throughout the loop while it's running, and that will basically be part of your test and update. At least 95% of the code you write that has to deal with loops will actually deal with the variable that you are initializing. Meaning, you could have the variable that you're initializing is going to be the variable that will keep track of your test as well as your update. So, for example, let's just see what the task we are doing here. The task we are doing here is that we want to print a number from 1 to what? We want to print something like 10 times, correct? So, what is the variable that we will be initializing? The variable that we will be initializing is an int. And what is that int going to do? It's going to keep track of how many times we printed something so far. So, for example, 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, 6 times. And you can see how that's going to play into my initialization where I initialize that variable and as well as my test. So, my test is going to be based on my initialization. And so, what's my initialization? Meaning, the test has to be the time where you stop the loop, meaning, when does the loop ever stop? And your test will determine that. In this case, I want the loop to stop when I printed at least 10 outputs of the thing that I am printing out. So meaning, what does that mean? That means if this variable is less than or equal to this variable. And what is that test? We spent like at least a couple videos explaining that that whole thing is a boolean. And what's my update? My update is when I do this, what's going to be my update? For example, I want to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and I want to print that out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That was a whole bunch of information, and I apologize. Let me go ahead and show you with an example. I feel like if I show an example, this will probably make sense. So the syntax for a loop is for, and then parentheses, and you are going to have these three. Every single loop you write will have such statements: an initialization, a test, and an update. In this case, what is my initialization? I want to have a variable, so I say int I, and how do I do an initialization? We talked about that last couple of videos. If you don't remember, we need to create a variable. In this case, again, it happens inside the loop. So int, I'll just call it I. You'll see a lot of people write I, and you set it equal to a number. In this case, I'll start at 1 because that's where I want to start. I want to print out 1, 2, 3, 4, like at least 10 outputs. And you see how I put a semicolon right there. This is my initialization right there. My initialization says I'm going to have a variable I is going to be equal to 1. And now the next thing that follows after that semicolon is my test. And what is my test? My test is when do I want to stop? In this case, I told you I want to print this out. I can't remember. Did I say 6 or 10? But I said I want to print this out 10 times. For example, I want to print it out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And what's changing every time? I know my I is going to change every single time, and that's going to keep track of how many outputs I have produced so far. So my test is going to be I is less than or equal to 10. So what is that saying? It's saying while I has not yet been greater than 10, so what's going to make this condition false? What number, for example, here will make this condition false? In this case, it's 11. For example, if I had 11 is less than or equal to 10, 11 is greater than 10, and 11 is not equal to 10. So this condition will evaluate to false. So in order for the loop to run, the condition has to be true. And that's the idea of booleans. See how we are using booleans now in this instance, and then we put a semicolon there. And now comes my update, and this is where I feel like a lot of people get so lost in this. The update is what happens after the loop has been executed. So in this case, what's going to be my update? My update is going to be I want I to update to 1. So in this case, I can do I plus equals 1. I can't remember if I showed you guys this way or if I showed you guys the I plus plus. Again, that's what essentially what it's saying is take I and add 1 to it every iteration. And then you put a closing parentheses, and then you have an opening bracket and a closing bracket. And this is the important part. Whatever thing that you want to do over and over again has to be contained inside the loop. So that's just basically that. So let me go ahead and compile. If I can save it. Sorry, I want to save it here. And let me go ahead and run it. And it didn't run. That's because I never called that method that I have created. I will go ahead and do that. See how it printed out this thing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It printed out I love me 10 times. So basically, the whole thing I want you guys to take away from this is whenever you have a loop, it always goes an initialization, a test, and an update. And think of it like this: whatever task you're asked to solve. For example, if I say print out the numbers from 1 to 100, or process the file that has 700 lines of code. You could see that you're going to start from a number. Most cases, going to be 0 or 1. Majority of the time is going to be 1. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You're going to be counting up. In the next video, I'll show you different ways that loops could be generated. So the whole takeaway is that you want to start from a number, and then your test is going to evaluate to true or false, which is a boolean, and that dictates how many times this loop will be able to run. And then your update. So what happens is the initialization and the test get updated. If this is true, what it does is it will print this out, and then it will go to your update. And your update is what needs to happen, and I will show you ways that loops can go wrong in the next videos coming up. But the whole thing is your update has to be something that gets you closer and closer to your test, because the thing is, if your test is never false, that means your loop will never stop running, and we know computers will run your loop forever, probably till eternity or probably till it runs out of memory. But the whole idea is your update has to be something that will get you closer and closer to your test, causing it to fail at some point, and that at some point is where you want to stop. In this case, I wanted to print out the numbers from 1 to 10. And so I go 1, okay, I print this out, and I go to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then I went to 11, and that's when I want to stop. And so that's because my test failed. Because I'm updating I by 1 every time, I caused my loop to stop running. As a result, that's the correct way to do it, because that's when I want to stop running, when my loop goes to 10. And it's probably greater than 10, which in this case is 11. So that's just basically the idea of loops. This is just like a little introduction to it. Again, I feel like most people get so hung up on the idea of what loops is and how to actually do it, but they never actually understand what the loop is and what to do in like different cases to think about. So I hope that you are able to understand what loops are in this video, and I will see you in another video. Thanks for watching.